Marlena Cassidy stared at the red paint still wet on her cabin door, the color bright against the weathered wood like blood on snow. In her 50 years, she had never imagined that choosing a paint color would destroy her life. The certified letter in her mailbox bore yesterday's date, but the legal language inside referenced property deeds from 1847 that she had never seen before. How could the Lakeside Hills Homeowners Association claim ownership of her inherited lake when her husband had left her clear title documents? The letter demanded she appear before the HOA board in 72 hours to explain not only her unauthorized exterior modification, but also her questionable claim to community waterfront resources. But Marlena painted dozens of projects over the years without any complaints. Why was today different? And why did the HOA president suddenly care about property lines that stood unchallenged for generations? The strangest part was the attached survey map showing her lake marked as disputed territory, when no dispute had existed the week before. 3 days earlier, Marlena had simply wanted to honor her late husband Daniel's memory by painting the front door of their cabin the same red he had chosen for their first apartment 40 years ago. She mixed the paint herself, carefully matching the exact shade from a sample she saved in their photo albums. The cabin sat on 18 acres of pine forest, surrounding a pristine 12-acre lake that Daniel inherited from his grandfather in 1998. They moved here from Phoenix after Daniel's retirement from the Postal Service, seeking the peace and quiet that only the Arizona high country could provide. For 7 years, they lived here without any interference from the Lakeside Hills development that grew up around their property in the early 2000s. The HOA was formed by the new residents, but Daniel's property predated the development by decades. This made them exempt from association rules, or so they always believed. Now, 6 months after Daniel's funeral, everything seemed to be falling apart. Marlena received 3 previous notices about minor infractions. Her mailbox was allegedly 2 inches too close to the road. Her woodpile was supposedly visible from the street, and her pickup truck was apparently parked at an improper angle. She ignored them all, knowing her property was not subject to HOA jurisdiction. But this letter was different. This letter questioned her very right to live here. This letter mentioned lawyers and court proceedings and property seizure. But what terrified Marlena most was the final paragraph, which stated that the HOA would be conducting a comprehensive property evaluation tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, whether she consented or not. At 8:55 the next morning, Marlena stood behind her red door, watching through the peephole as 2 black SUVs approached her cabin. Richard Stonewell emerged from the first vehicle, wearing an expensive suit that looked completely out of place in the Arizona wilderness. He was accompanied by a young woman with a briefcase and an older man carrying surveying equipment. From the second SUV came 2 men she didn't recognize, both dressed in matching polo shirts with Lakeside Hills Property Management embroidered on the chest. Marlena opened the door before they could knock, determined to maintain control of the situation on her own property. "Mrs. Cassidy," Stonewell said, not offering his hand, "I trust you received our correspondence regarding today's inspection." His tone was cold and professional, as if he were speaking to a delinquent tenant rather than a property owner. "This is Rebecca Morris from our legal department, and Frank Wheeler, our certified surveyor. We're here to document the current property conditions and verify the boundaries of your claimed holdings." The way he emphasized the word claimed made Marlena's stomach clench. Stonewell gestured toward the lake without waiting for her permission. "We'll be examining the waterfront area first, then the structure itself. I trust you'll provide access to all areas as required by County Ordinance 47B. Marlena had never heard of County Ordinance 47B, but before she could ask about it, Stonewell and his team were already walking toward the lake. She followed them, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Stonewell, my husband's property deed clearly establishes ownership of this entire parcel, including the lake. I don't understand why you're questioning something that was settled legally decades ago." Stonewell stopped at the water's edge and turned to face her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Cassidy, we've discovered some interesting discrepancies in the historical records. It appears your husband may have been operating under an incorrect assumption about the extent of his property rights. Our research indicates that this lake was designated as a community resource in the original 1847 territorial survey, predating any individual ownership claims." Rebecca Morris opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. "These are copies of the territorial records we obtained from the state archives last week. According to these surveys, The lake and its immediate surroundings were reserved for community use by the early settlers. Any subsequent deeds that included lake access may have been issued in error. Frank Wheeler was already setting up his surveying equipment, completely ignoring Marlena's protests about permission. "We'll need to establish the correct property lines based on the original territorial markers," he called out. "This survey could take most of the day." Marlena felt her world spinning out of control. How could documents from 1847 suddenly appear after all these years? Why was the HOA so determined to challenge her property rights now, just months after Daniel's death? And why did Richard Stonewell seem so confident that he would win this fight? As she watched the surveyor drive stakes into the ground near her dock, a terrible realization began to form. This wasn't about a red door or HOA violations. This was about something much bigger. But what could her small mountain lake possibly be worth to these people? By noon, Frank Wheeler drove survey stakes around the entire perimeter of Marlena's lake, each metal rod marking what he claimed were the true community boundaries established in 1847. Marlena watched in growing horror as the surveyor worked his way closer to her cabin, measuring distances and recording coordinates that would apparently prove her family was trespassing for decades. Richard Stonewell stood near the dock, talking quietly on his cell phone while Rebecca Morris photographed every structure on the property. The way they moved with such precision suggested this was not their first property seizure. But what Marlena couldn't understand was why they seemed so certain of victory before any court had ruled on the matter. "Mrs. Cassidy," Stonewell called out as he ended his phone call. "I've just spoken with our development partners about the timeline for this transition. Given the complexity of relocating an established resident, we're prepared to offer you 60 days to find alternative housing. That's quite generous considering the legal circumstances." Marlena felt her knees go weak. "Development partners? What are you talking about?" "This is my home, Mr. Stonewell. You can't just decide to relocate me based on some old papers that conveniently appeared last week." Stonewell's expression remained coldly professional. "Mrs. Cassidy, Mountain Vista Resort has been planning an expansion project for this area for over 2 years. The lake property is essential to their plans. We've been working with the county to resolve any ownership disputes, so the project can move forward on schedule." The words hit Marlena like a physical blow. Mountain Vista Resort was the massive development that destroyed wilderness areas across northern Arizona for the past decade. They built luxury vacation compounds that catered to wealthy tourists, while displacing local families and wildlife. Daniel always said they would never get their hands on his grandfather's land, but Daniel was gone now. Marlena was facing this alone. "You planned this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The HOA violations, the property disputes, all of it. You've been setting me up so you could sell my land to resort developers." Stonewell didn't deny it. "Mrs. Cassidy, this is simply business. The community will benefit greatly from the jobs and revenue that Mountain Vista brings to the area. Your personal attachment to this property, while understandable, cannot stand in the way of economic progress." Rebecca Morris approached with her camera and clipboard. "We'll need access to the interior of your residence to complete our documentation. The county requires a full inventory before any ownership transfers can be processed." Marlena stepped back toward her red door. "You're not coming inside my house. I don't care what county ordinance you think gives you that authority." But even as she spoke, Marlena realized how helpless she was against their coordinated legal assault. They had lawyers, surveyors, county connections, and resort money backing their efforts. What did she have? A handful of old deed papers, and the memory of her husband's voice promising that this land would always be theirs. Frank Wheeler called out from near the pine trees. "I'm reading some unusual elevation markers over here. These don't match the territorial survey records." Stonewell and Morris hurried toward the surveyor, leaving Marlena alone by her cabin. This was her chance. She slipped inside and went straight to Daniel's old filing cabinet, the one she had been avoiding since his funeral. If there was any hope of fighting this legal nightmare, the answers would be buried somewhere in his meticulous record-keeping. But as she pulled open the bottom drawer, she found something that made her blood run cold. A letter addressed to Daniel, dated just 3 weeks before his heart attack, from a law firm she had never heard of. The subject line read, "Final notice regarding territorial survey discrepancies." Marlena's hands trembled as she opened the letter that Daniel apparently hid from her during his final weeks. The law firm of Harrison Burke and Associates wrote to inform Daniel that recent archival research has revealed potential irregularities in your family's property claim dating back to the original territorial survey of 1847. The letter went on to state that interested parties are prepared to pursue legal remedies to correct these historical oversights, and that Daniel had 30 days to respond with documentation proving his ownership rights. The date stamp showed Daniel had received this letter on February 15th. He died on March 8th. 3 weeks of keeping this secret from her. 3 weeks of knowing their home was under attack. 3 weeks of stress that might have contributed to the heart attack that killed him. But there was more in the filing cabinet. Beneath the threatening letter, Marlena found a manila folder labeled Lake Property Research in Daniel's careful handwriting. Inside were photocopies of territorial maps, deed transfers, and survey records that painted a very different picture than what Stonewall's team was claiming. According to Daniel's research, the 1847 territorial survey designated the lake area for community use by local inhabitants, but that designation was legally superseded in 1863. Daniel's great-great-grandfather, Samuel Cassidy, purchased the land directly from the territorial government. The purchase included mineral rights, water rights, and exclusive use of all natural resources within the surveyed boundaries. Daniel had traced the ownership through 6 generations of Cassidy family members, each transfer properly recorded and legally binding. More importantly, Daniel had discovered that the territorial survey records being cited by the HOA were not the original documents. They were modified copies created in 1998, the same year that Lakeside Hills development had been proposed. Someone had been planning this seizure for over 25 years, waiting for the right moment to strike. The original 1847 survey was held in the state archives in Phoenix, and Daniel had requested certified copies just days before his death. But Marlena couldn't find those copies anywhere in the filing cabinet. Either Daniel had hidden them somewhere else, or someone had taken them after his funeral. The sound of vehicles starting up outside drew Marlena's attention. Through the window, she could see Stonewall's team packing their equipment. The survey was apparently complete. Frank Wheeler was loading his gear while talking animatedly to Stonewall and Morris. Whatever they had found during their measurements had clearly pleased them. Stonewall walked toward the cabin and knocked on the red door. "Mrs. Cassidy, our documentation is complete. You'll receive our official report within 48 hours, along with a formal notice to vacate. I strongly advise you to begin making arrangements immediately." Marlena opened the door with Daniel's research folder clutched against her chest. "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Stonewall, and I'm going to fight your fraudulent claims with every legal resource I can find." Stonewall's confident smile faltered slightly when he saw the papers in her arms. "What do you have there, Mrs. Cassidy?" She held up one of Daniel's photocopied maps. "Proof that your 1847 survey documents are forgeries. My family has owned this property legally for over a century and a half. Your resort friends are going to have to find somewhere else to build their luxury playground." For the first time since this nightmare began, Marlena saw genuine concern flash across Stonewall's face. "Mrs. Cassidy, I don't know what you think you found, but I assure you, our legal position is solid. These proceedings will move forward regardless of any amateur research your husband may have conducted." But his voice lacked the absolute confidence it had carried all morning. Rebecca Morris was whispering urgently in his ear, and Frank Wheeler kept glancing nervously toward Marlena's door. They knew something about Daniel's research. They knew he had been close to exposing their scheme. The question was, how close had he come before his heart gave out? After Stonewall's team left, Marlena spent the afternoon tearing through every drawer, box, and file cabinet in the house, searching for the certified copies of the original territorial survey that Daniel requested before his death. She found insurance papers, tax records, and decades of utility bills, but nothing from the state archives. Either Daniel hid those documents somewhere she couldn't imagine, or someone removed them from the house. The thought that strangers might have been inside her home made her skin crawl. But who would have access? The only people with keys were herself, Daniel's brother in California, and their neighbor Mrs. Chen, who fed their cats when they traveled. At 5 o'clock, Marlena drove to Mrs. Chen's house, a small ranch-style home about a quarter-mile down the mountain road. Linda Chen was 72 years old and sharp as a tack. She tended a magnificent vegetable garden and knew everything that happened in their quiet corner of the woods. If anyone had seen suspicious activity around Marlena's cabin, it would be Linda. The older woman answered her door wearing dirt-stained gardening gloves and a concerned expression. "Marlena, dear, I saw all those fancy cars at your place today. Is everything all right?" Linda's eyes were kind but worried. She invited Marlena inside for coffee and listened carefully as Marlena explained the HOA's legal attack and her desperate search for Daniel's missing documents. "I remember when Daniel came by about 6 weeks ago, maybe 7, Linda said, stirring cream into her coffee. "He seemed very upset about something. He asked me if I'd noticed anyone watching your house or taking pictures of your property. I told him no, but he made me promise to call him immediately if I saw anything suspicious." Linda paused, her weathered hands wrapped around the warm mug. "He also asked me to keep something safe for him. Said it was insurance in case anything happened to him. I thought he was being overly cautious because of his heart condition. But now I wonder if he knew something we didn't." Marlena felt her pulse quicken. "Linda, what did he give you to keep safe?" The older woman stood up and walked to an antique secretary desk in the corner of her living room. She pulled out a small key and unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside was a sealed manila envelope with Marlena's name written in Daniel's careful script across the front. "He made me swear not to give this to you unless something happened to him and you came asking for help. He said if you needed this envelope, you'd know exactly what it was about." Linda's voice was gentle but serious. "Honey, I think Daniel was trying to protect you from something, and that something has finally caught up with you." Marlena's hands shook as she opened the envelope. Inside were 3 items: a handwritten letter from Daniel, a business card for an attorney in Phoenix named Elena Reeves, and a key to a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Flagstaff. Daniel's letter was brief but urgent. "My dearest Marlena, if you're reading this, then the vultures have come for our land. I should have told you about the threats, but I hoped I could handle this alone. The documents you need are in the safety deposit box. Elena Reeves specializes in territorial land disputes and property rights. She knows our case and has been paid a retainer to help you. Don't trust the HOA. Don't trust the county records office, and don't let them intimidate you into giving up what's rightfully ours. Our love built this life together. Don't let them destroy it. All my love, Daniel." But there was something else in the envelope that made Marlena's blood run cold. A photograph of Richard Stonewell shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit outside the Mountain Vista Resort headquarters. The date stamp on the back showed the photo was taken 3 days before Daniel received the threatening letter from the law firm. Someone had been watching Daniel, photographing his enemies and documenting the conspiracy against their property. The question was, who had taken this picture, and why had they given it to Daniel as a warning? The next morning, Marlena drove to Flagstaff. The safety deposit box key was clenched tightly in her hand, and Elena Reeves's business card waited in her purse. The First National Bank sat on a busy corner downtown, its stone facade giving an impression of stability and permanence that Marlena desperately needed. She approached the customer service desk and explained that she needed to access her late husband's safety deposit box. The banker, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, asked for identification and the death certificate. After reviewing the documents and confirming that Marlena was the authorized survivor, she led her down a narrow hallway to the vault. Inside the small metal box, Marlena found exactly what Daniel had promised: certified copies of the original 1847 territorial survey, the 1863 land purchase documents, and a complete chain of title showing unbroken Cassidy family ownership for over 150 years. But there was more. Daniel had compiled a thick folder documenting the HOA's harassment campaign against longtime residents. The pattern was clear. Families whose properties blocked planned resort developments faced identical legal challenges. Photographs showed 5 other families who had been forced to sell their land after facing similar threats. Each case followed the same pattern: minor HOA violations, escalating to property seizure threats, followed by mysterious discoveries of territorial survey discrepancies. The final document in the box made Marlena's stomach clench with rage. A contract between Mountain Vista Resort and the Lakeside Hills HOA, dated 18 months ago. The agreement outlined a profit-sharing scheme for any properties successfully acquired through legal remediation of historical ownership disputes. The HOA would receive 30% of development profits for each parcel they helped transfer to the resort company. Richard Stonewell's signature was bold and confident at the bottom, right next to a payment schedule, showing he had already received $50,000 as an advance against future seizures. Marlena photographed every document with her phone and secured the originals back in the box. She needed to call Elena Reeves immediately, but as she walked toward the bank exit, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the timing made her answer. "Mrs. Cassidy, this is Frank Wheeler. I was the surveyor at your property yesterday." His voice was nervous and rushed. "I need to meet with you as soon as possible. There are things you need to know about what we found during our survey, things that Mr. Stonewell doesn't want me to tell you." Wheeler's breathing was heavy, as if he was walking quickly or looking over his shoulder. "Can you meet me at the Denny's restaurant on Route 17 in 30 minutes? I'll be wearing a red baseball cap and sitting in the back booth." Against her better judgment, Marlena agreed to meet him. Frank Wheeler was already waiting when she arrived, nervously stirring a cup of coffee that had clearly been sitting untouched for a while. He looked around the restaurant before speaking, ensuring they were not being overheard. "Mrs. Cassidy, I've been a surveyor for 22 years, and I've never been asked to falsify measurements before yesterday. Mr. Stonewell wanted me to move the boundary markers to make it appear that your lake falls outside your property lines. But the truth is your deed boundaries are exactly where they should be. Your family owns every inch of that lake, and the original survey stakes are still buried under decades of pine needles." Wheeler pulled out a small digital camera and showed her photographs he had taken of the original boundary markers. "I found these metal stakes about 6 inches underground, exactly where your great-great-grandfather's survey placed them in 1863. They're stamped with the territorial government seal and the Cassidy family name." The surveyor's hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through the photographs. "Mr. Stonewell ordered me to remove them and replace them with new stakes that would support his false boundary claims." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Mrs. Cassidy, I can't be part of this fraud anymore, but I'm terrified of what he might do if he knows I'm talking to you." But their conversation was interrupted by familiar voices near the restaurant entrance. Through the window, Marlena could see Richard Stonewell and Rebecca Morris walking toward the building, apparently heading inside for their own meeting. Wheeler's face went pale with terror. "He can't see me talking to you. If he finds out I told you about the original stakes, I'm finished." The surveyor gathered his camera and stood up quickly. "Mrs. Cassidy, protect those photographs I just showed you. And whatever you do, don't let him know that you've found the real boundary markers." Marlena slipped out of the restaurant through the kitchen exit, while Stonewell and Morris were being seated at their table. She drove straight to Phoenix, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she processed everything Wheeler had revealed. Elena Reeves's law office occupied the 15th floor of a glass building downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the desert valley. The attorney was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone who had spent years fighting powerful opponents in court. She listened intently as Marlena explained the HOA's fraudulent survey and Wheeler's confession about the falsified boundary markers. "Mrs. Cassidy, your husband contacted me 6 weeks ago with concerns about threats to your property. He paid a retainer and asked me to prepare for potential litigation against the HOA and Mountain Vista Resort." Elena spread the documents from the safety deposit box across her conference table. "These territorial surveys and land purchase records are exactly what we need to establish your family's legitimate ownership. But the profit-sharing contract between Stonewell and the resort is the smoking gun that proves fraudulent conspiracy." The attorney photographed each document with a professional camera, creating a complete record for the court filing. Elena picked up her phone and dialed a number from memory. "Judge Morrison? This is Elena Reeves. I need an emergency restraining order and an expedited hearing for a property rights case involving HOA fraud and attempted illegal seizure. How quickly can you see us?" After a brief conversation, she hung up and turned to Marlena with the first smile she had seen in days. "We have a hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Judge Morrison takes property fraud very seriously, especially when it involves conspiracy to defraud longtime residents for corporate profit." The attorney spent the next 3 hours preparing their case, organizing the evidence into a compelling narrative that would expose Stonewell's scheme. Elena had researched the 5 previous families who had been forced to sell their properties after similar HOA harassment campaigns. 3 of those families had retained documentation proving they had been victims of the same falsified territorial survey claims. "Mrs. Cassidy, we're not just fighting for your property. We're exposing a pattern of systematic fraud that has been stealing family land for resort development. This case could shut down their entire operation." That evening, Marlena returned to her cabin and sat on the porch, looking out over the lake that had been at the center of this legal nightmare. The water reflected the pine trees and the last rays of sunset, creating the peaceful scene that Daniel had loved so much. She thought about his determination to protect this land and his foresight in gathering evidence against their enemies. The red door behind her stood as a symbol of the choice she had made to honor his memory, a choice that had inadvertently triggered this battle, but ultimately led to the discovery of Stonewall's corruption. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Cassidy, this is Frank Wheeler. I wanted you to know that I've decided to testify in court tomorrow about the falsified survey. Mr. Stonewall threatened to destroy my business, but I can't live with being part of his fraud. I'll bring the original photographs of your family's boundary stakes and explain exactly what he ordered me to do. It's the right thing to do, and your husband would have wanted someone to stand up for the truth." Marlena felt tears of gratitude rolling down her cheeks. Daniel's legacy was bringing together allies she never expected to find. Tomorrow they would face Stonewall's lies with the truth that had been buried for too long. The red door that started this fight would stand as a symbol of their victory, proof that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can expose the biggest injustices. The courtroom was packed the next morning with residents from the Lakeside Hills community, many of whom had never realized their HOA president was running a property seizure scheme with a resort corporation. Judge Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s with decades of experience in property law, listened carefully as Elena Reeves presented the evidence of systematic fraud. The certified copies of the original 1847 territorial survey and the 1863 Cassidy family land purchase documents established clear and unbroken ownership of the lake property for over 150 years. When Elena displayed the profit-sharing contract between Stonewall and Mountain Vista Resort, showing the $50,000 advance payment for successful property seizures, the courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Morrison called for order and fixed Richard Stonewall with a withering stare. "Mr. Stonewall, these documents suggest you have been using your position as HOA president to facilitate property theft for personal financial gain. How do you respond to these allegations?" Stonewall's expensive attorney tried to argue that the HOA had legitimate concerns about territorial survey discrepancies, but his arguments crumbled when Frank Wheeler took the witness stand. Wheeler's testimony was devastating. He explained how Stonewall had pressured him to falsify survey measurements and remove the original 1863 boundary markers buried on Marlena's property. Under oath, Wheeler presented the photographs of the authentic territorial boundary stakes bearing the Cassidy family name and the official territorial government seal. "Your Honor, Mrs. Cassidy's property boundaries are exactly where they have been for over a century and a half. Mr. Stonewall knew this, but he ordered me to create false evidence to support his seizure attempt." The surveyor's voice was steady and clear as he continued. "I have 22 years of professional reputation at stake, and I refuse to be part of this fraud any longer." Judge Morrison's ruling was swift and uncompromising. The evidence clearly establishes that Mrs. Cassidy holds legitimate and unchallenged title to the disputed lake property. The HOA's claims are based entirely on falsified documents and fraudulent survey work conducted in conspiracy with Mountain Vista Resort for financial gain. I hereby order the immediate dismissal of all HOA claims against Mrs. Cassidy's property. The judge's gaze moved to Stonewall, whose face had gone pale. "Furthermore, I am referring this case to the district attorney for criminal investigation of property fraud, conspiracy, and theft by deception. Mr. Stonewall, you are prohibited from holding any position of authority in the Lakeside Hills HOA, and all property seizure proceedings are permanently enjoined." The courtroom erupted in applause as residents who had been terrorized by Stonewall's harassment campaigns finally saw justice. Elena Reeves squeezed Marlena's hand and whispered, "Your husband would be proud. You didn't just save your property, you exposed a criminal operation and protected your entire community." As they left the courthouse, Wheeler approached Marlena with one final revelation. "Mrs. Cassidy, I need to tell you who gave your husband that photograph of Stonewall at the resort. It was me. I took that picture when I started getting suspicious about his development connections. Your husband was the only person brave enough to take action when I showed him the evidence." 2 weeks later, Marlena stood on her porch, looking out over the lake that would forever remain in the Cassidy family. The red door behind her had dried to a perfect shade of crimson, exactly the color Daniel had chosen for their first apartment 40 years ago. Richard Stonewall had been arrested and charged with multiple felonies. Mountain Vista Resort had abandoned their expansion plans after the fraud scandal made national news. The HOA had elected new leadership committed to protecting residents' rights rather than exploiting them. Marlena had kept her promise to Daniel's memory, and in doing so, she had discovered her own strength and the power of community when good people stand together against corruption. The lake reflected the afternoon sun like a mirror, peaceful and eternal, exactly as it should be. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where justice and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.